I asked on social media for some of your hottest philosophical takes. We're going to go through some of what I received. And I think I want to give them a rating on how spicy they are. And I remember once being in a restaurant where the options for the food were mild, spicy, very spicy, and Indian spicy. So I think I'm going to borrow that measurement. So let's find out if your takes are mild. I suppose minty is the opposite of spicy. Spicy or Indian spicy. God shows his mercy to sinners by sending them to hell. This sounds kind of weird on the face of it. Surely if God was being as merciful as possible, he'd allow even unrepentant sinners to get into heaven. But there is this idea in Christianity that hell isn't so much a punishment for sinners, but rather the natural place where sinners would most like to end up. That is, they've made their own decision that they don't want to be with God, and God simply says, as C.S. Lewis had it, "Thy will be done." But I do think that this branding of hell as not a punishment for unrepentant sinners, but rather just a natural place where sinners end up as a result of their own choice. So if anything, it's God's love in action. It's a fairly common one in Christianity, so I think I'm going to give this mild. The Catholic Church is correct in everything she teaches. Of course, I don't think that this is correct, and I think it's quite a bold claim, but in terms of its spiciness and controversy as a Catholic, I don't think it's particularly strong, so again, I'm going to have to give this a mild. I must say I would find it difficult to defend the claim that the Catholic Church is correct in everything that she teaches, given that she has a history of, well, getting things wrong. For example, in the trial of Galileo, this famous scientist was punished for not just, as some Catholics like to claim, presenting his worldview without evidence or something like that, but specifically for the wrongness of his belief. I'm quoting here from the sentencing of Galileo. That the sun is the center of the world and motionless is a proposition which is philosophically absurd and false and formally heretical for being explicitly contrary to Holy Scripture. So the Church at one point, at least, thought that heliocentrism was philosophically absurd and false and contrary to Holy Scripture. If it's right in everything that it says, is this still true? I think I said something to upset the guy upstairs. The Eucharist is about ritual cannibalism and might have actually happened after Jesus' death, and can also explain why the body disappeared from the tomb and was never found afterwards. Indian spicy. Okay, it's time to get dark. I didn't choose to be born, therefore I should have the right to end my life, legally speaking. I have to say that I broadly agree with this. I think that if you have such thing as a right to life, that must entail a right to not live, just as having a right to freedom of speech must entail a right not to speak at all. If you're being forced by someone to say something, if you're suffering under compelled speech, I don't think that person is respecting your right to freedom of speech. Likewise, if somebody is forcing you to stay alive, I don't think they're respecting your right to life. Of course, the big debate at the moment is over assisted dying. That is, should it be legal for somebody else to help you to die if that's what you choose to do, in a medical setting, for example? Even today, of course, the issue of assisted suicide is highly politicized, and it's impossible to find unbiased information about the issue. We can, of course, never remove bias, but we can use tools to help manage and analyze that bias, and one of those tools is the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Ground News aggregates stories from thousands of local and international outlets in one place so you can compare the reporting. Take a look. Pope Francis recently commented on Portugal's decision to legalize euthanasia. Looking at the story on Ground News, I can compare headlines from across the political spectrum. Crux, a source labelled as Centre, quotes the Pope saying, "You don't mess with life." Breitbart, however, a right-wing source, chose to frame the story as the Pope denouncing the ugly compassion of abortion and euthanasia. I can also see a bias distribution on the side of the page. Of the sources with a clear political leaning, 80% of them reporting on this story are from the right, with only one from the centre and none from left-leaning outlets. So if you read mainly left-wing news, you could miss this story entirely without the help of Ground News. It even shows me who owns the outlets and gives me a factuality rating for the source. Understanding both sides of a story is obviously essential to the work that I do, and why I think this app and website are so useful. Not only do they provide context to the information, they also make it easy to see how the media frames important issues. Check it out for yourself at ground.news/AlexOC. And they're giving viewers of this channel 30% off unlimited access for as little as $5 a month. The link is in the description. Take a look for yourself at this genuinely unique news app. Back to the hot takes. But we should remember that it wasn't that long ago in my country, for example, that suicide itself was illegal. That is, it was a criminal offence to attempt to take your own life. In the UK, in July of 1958, a 59-year-old man was sentenced to 6 months in prison for attempting suicide and failing. According to Wikipedia, in ancient Athens, a person who had died of suicide without the approval of the state was denied the honors of a normal burial. The person would be buried alone on the outskirts of the city without a headstone or a marker. Considerably more amazing is a criminal ordinance that was issued by Louis XIV in France in 1670, which was far more severe in its punishment. The dead person's body was to be drawn through the streets, face down, and then hung or thrown on a garbage heap. Additionally, all of the person's property was confiscated. Nowadays, it seems quite unthinkable to have such legal consequences for committing suicide or attempting it, but there are still places in the world today where suicide is liable to punishment and even imprisonment. I think that the seminal essay on suicide was written by Arthur Schopenhauer, and he discusses this concept of the legality of suicide, saying the following: "Now let the reader's own moral feelings decide as to whether or not suicide is a criminal act. Think of the impression that would be made upon you by the news that someone you know had committed the crime, say, of murder or theft, or been guilty of some act of cruelty or deception, and compare it with your feelings when you hear that he has met a voluntary death. While in the one case, a lively sense of indignation and extreme resentment will be aroused, and you will call loudly for punishment or revenge. In the other, you will be moved to grief and sympathy, and mingled with your thoughts will be an admiration for his courage, rather than the moral disapproval which follows upon a wicked action. The most controversial element of that is probably the admiration for the courage of the person that Schopenhauer assumes that you would have. But putting that aside, I do think he helpfully illustrates here the intuitive difference between criminal behavior and that of suicide. But this one was a fairly popular suggestion. It got 31 likes, and I think that most people, when really pressed to think about it, will say that, of course, I can think of some kind of circumstance in which suicide should be at least permissible, and so I'm not sure how controversial this take is, but there seems to be an implicit suggestion here that somebody should be able to have the right to end their life essentially for any reason. That's probably a bit more controversial, but I'm still not quite sure if I can put it in the spicy category. I'm going to have to put it probably somewhere in the middle. Life is always, yes, always worth living. Well, look, I spoke too soon. Now, importantly, this doesn't seem to be a legal claim. That is, the person doesn't seem to be suggesting that you should legally have to stay alive. It seems to be more a claim about value, that whether or not it's legal to commit suicide, it's always the wrong thing to do because life is always valuable. For me, I think this just results from a poverty of imagination. If you can't think of a situation in which you believe suicide would be genuinely preferable to you, I just don't think you're trying hard enough. Imagine being contorted into an extremely painful position inside a box with no light and just enough food to keep you alive and stuck there for the rest of your life, and you knew that there was going to be no escape. In such a situation, I think I would find it difficult to be convinced of the intrinsic value of staying alive for staying alive's sake. In common parlance, people tend to say that life is almost always worth living. That is, in the vast majority of cases, yes, life is definitely worth continuing, but to say that it is always, yes, always worth living is just putting it a bit too strongly for me. And I think that most people would probably agree with that, and that's why I'm going to give this spicy. Libertarian free will exists. Oh, come on, Justin, you could have done better than that. Well, apparently you could have. Forgiveness can be toxic and actually impede people from improving themselves. I think the idea here is something like, if you're constantly forgiven for doing bad things, then you never actually get to improve your character because you can just keep getting away with this stuff. I do think that a necessary condition of genuine forgiveness is genuine apology on the part of the wrongdoer, and genuine apology requires genuine recognition of wrongdoing. It means that somebody has to really wish that they rather hadn't done the thing that they'd done. If that's the case, then I think that alone is enough to inspire progress. If somebody regrets the decisions they've made in the past, that's an incredibly motivating factor in improving your life. The problem, of course, is an epistemic one. How can we know that someone is genuinely sorry? If they say they're sorry and they're not, and we forgive them, then I think it can allow them to essentially get away with anything and not ever develop their character. But in that case, I don't think it's because we're forgiving them that they're not developing, but rather because they're not recognizing what they did was actually wrong. Having said that, for such people, not allowing them to just get away with things, not just forgiving them for doing things wrong when they're not genuinely sorry, would give them an extra reason to act differently, and so it might develop them in that way. But I'm not sure that this kind of human development at the threat of social pressure is the kind of human development that we're really valuing in a conversation like this. Still, I think it's a perfectly intelligible thing to say and perfectly reasonable, even if we might dispute it ultimately, and so I think I'm going to give it minty. Wow, this one's got 47 likes. Jesus of Nazareth is particularly the only way to eternal life. Well, given that it's got so many likes, and given that it, forms the foundation of the Christian religion, I can hardly call it a spicy take. In fact, I think I'm going to have to give it minty. Remember, the prompt was to be unique and controversial, and you've just described the basis of the world's most popular religious belief system. If I knew what a hot take was, I might be able to answer your question. How about some more precision in framing your question? Respect your reader. Okay, that one's pretty spicy, actually. If moral realism is false, then nothing matters. Speaking objectively, this could be almost a tautology. If there's no such thing as objective value, then nothing objectively matters. Of course, it's still going to be the case that things will matter to individuals subjectively, but in a world where there's no objectivity to these values, these are not going to be based in anything concrete. And so saying nothing matters, I think, needs to be qualified with the idea that things will still matter to people, but I think what you mean is that they don't matter objectively, which I think I would probably agree with. And whether I agree with it or not, I think it's a fairly popular philosophical view, so I'm going to have to give it mild. Even if we are 100% sure of an idea, it can be wrong. Now, this one seems fairly straightforward. Of course, you can be 100% certain about something and it be wrong. I can conceive of a person for some psychological reason being 100% certain that the Earth is flat and they're wrong. So yeah, of course this is true. However, there are some philosophical implications of this. For example, the most famous attempt to ground philosophy in basic, undeniable statements was made by Descartes in his Meditations on First Philosophy. Famously, when trying to discover those items of knowledge which we simply cannot doubt, he landed upon "Je pense, donc je suis." Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And for many, the idea is that this can be some kind of foundation of knowledge, or at least one thing that we can know, because there's simply no way to doubt it. As long as you are thinking, you know that there must be a you to do the thinking. Now, I have a whole video on this phrase, what it actually means, and indeed what it actually proves, if anything. But the most pertinent thing here is that I don't think Descartes actually proves that you can know that you exist. What Descartes shows is that you can't doubt that you exist. This isn't quite the same thing. I think that what Descartes achieves in the Meditations is showing quite compellingly that you can be certain that you exist. It's simply not something that you can doubt. But does certainty confer truth? I certainly don't think it does, at least not necessarily. And so if it is the case that you can be 100% certain about something and yet be wrong about it, then I think, therefore I am is something that, yeah, you can be certain about, but that doesn't mean that you can actually know that you exist. It could still be false. So given the implication of this take, I mean, it essentially undermines this popular interpretation of Descartes that he managed to establish that you can know that it's true that you exist. I think I have to rate this kind of spicy. Time doesn't exist. It's not even a philosophical take. That one's definitely Indian spicy. Not the view that time doesn't exist, the view that saying time doesn't exist is somehow not a philosophical take. That itself is an incredibly spicy philosophical take. Dialogues are overhyped. It's a more digestible way to learn, but it can be biased when only one person writes it. Dialogues are one of the most popular ways to convey philosophical ideas. Plato used them, Hume used them, Galileo used them, amongst many others, of course. And I understand the fear here that given one person is writing both sides of the debate, there's going to be some bias involved, but I think that's kind of the point. In many dialogues, the idea is not just to discuss philosophical ideas back and forth, but to argue for a point, and they're just doing this through the means of dialogue. For example, one of the reasons why the Catholic Church was so angry with Galileo is that he published a text called A Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Ostensibly, this text was just a dialogue between different characters discussing their different worldviews, but to anybody reading, it's quite clear which view is the one that Galileo himself held. Those arguments are just a little bit stronger and a little bit more forceful than the other ones in the text. And so this dialogue was seen as part of the reason why Galileo could be accused of heresy, even though it was indeed a dialogue. A modern example of this is the kind of thing that you might see on TikTok. Here's an example from my friend Justin Brierley, who's making an argument for the existence of God, but doing it in the form of a dialogue.
Hey, Christian, why do you believe in all that weird supernatural stuff?
I've got my reasons. Why do you believe what you believe?
I'm an atheist. I don't have any beliefs to defend.
Really? Well, what about the universe? Where do you believe that came from?
I don't know. From nowhere, I guess.
Now, would I say that dialogue is an overrated way of doing philosophy because Justin is clearly biased here? Well, no, because that's kind of the point. He's not trying to do some objective presentation of different worldviews without presenting an opinion of his own. He's using the dialogue as a means to argue for his own case. That's what dialogues are often for. So I think that to say they're overhyped because of the bias of the author is mistaken. And given that this also isn't a particularly controversial thing to say, I'm going to have to give it a minty rating. The reason why two twin brothers or two twin sisters can't have consensual sex is because it's icky. Now this is interesting because I have seen secular ethicists struggle greatly to condemn incestuous sexual behavior. And I think the reason for this is that if you're, say, a utilitarian and you just think that minimization of suffering is the only metric by which we judge whether things are moral, then in a situation where two people have consensual sex and don't cause any suffering, what could possibly be the problem? And yet there's something so intuitively wrong about incest that people will trip over themselves to try to find a way to condemn it nonetheless. My own ethical worldview is unsettled, but I find myself mostly in alignment with ethical emotivism. It's a view that somewhat went out of favor in the 20th century, but I think it still makes sense. Ethical emotivism is the view that moral statements or moral propositions, when spoken, are just expressions of emotion. Famously, A.J. Ayer described this as saying that murder is wrong is just the same as going, boo murder. Similarly, saying that courage is good is just the same as expressing, yay courage. These expressions don't have truth value. Saying that murder is wrong is not the same thing as saying, I don't like murder. That's something that can be true or false. It can be true that I don't like murder. Saying murder is wrong is just expressing, boo murder. And that's not something that can be true or false. It's immune to truth value. And so ethical emotivists think that when we say something is wrong, we're doing something analogous to just thinking of it as icky and expressing that ickiness. And so on ethical emotivism, it's fairly easy to still make sense of the claim incest is wrong, because that is just an expression of an emotional state. So my ethical worldview is one that I think easily allows a person to say, yeah, incest is wrong. But for a lot of secular ethicists, if they're not emotivists and they believe that ethics has truth value grounded in something like suffering, it's a famously difficult thing to do. But yeah, I think anything involving this kind of material is going to naturally end up in the spicy category. Democracy seems to be the breeding ground for populism. I think I'm going to give this a mild rating, not because I don't think it's true, but because I think it's something that's quite widely recognized even amongst proponents of democracy. Winston Churchill is often attributed as having said, democracy is the worst form of government, except all the other ones that we've tried. And this embodies the spirit that even those who are in favor of democracy don't think that it's some kind of fix-all solution that's going to give us a perfect political society and government, but rather that it's just the best option we have. Given that we know that there can't really be such a thing as a perfect political system, those who are in favor of democracy will have to recognize that it's going to have some problems, it's going to have some costs. And the most famous cost of all with democracy is the idea that sometimes people make the wrong choices, or sometimes people elect people that we don't like. Yeah, this is true, but I think most people recognize this and say, what's the alternative? I think it's something that's fairly widely recognized even amongst its proponents. For that reason, I'm going to give this a mild rating. Anyway, I think that will do it for now. If you like this video, let me know, we can do more. Follow me on social media for the next time that I ask for your philosophical hot takes. Thank you for watching, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.